Hello viewers and welcome to another episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we're talking about the land of maple syrup and Ben & Jerry's ice cream. I'm talking about the state of Vermont. The name Vermont actually comes from two French words, vert and mont, meaning green and mountain, hence the Green Mountain State. It was the first state to be admitted to the Union after the original 13 colonies, and also the last state to get a Walmart in 1996. The state also has a very progressive history. It was one of the first to give women partial voting rights. It was one of the first to abolish slavery. It was also one of the first to legitimize same-sex marriage from a legal standpoint. That progressive quality continues today and is very apparent in how Vermonters vote during elections. So let's jump straight into the House elections for Vermont for 2020. Vermont has one at-large congressional district, meaning it covers the entire state. It has a partisan lean of plus 15 into the Democratic column when compared to the national average, according to the Cook Political Report's Partisan Voting Index. The state is represented by a man named Peter Welch, a Democrat, who is running for his 8th term this November. He is facing an undetermined Republican opponent in what should be a pretty straightforward election for him this year. Little extra trivia about the district. Prior to Welch's first electoral victory in 2006, the district was represented for about 16 years by a man some of you may have heard named Bernie Sanders. Sanders, who is better known today for his presidential campaigns, was first elected to represent Vermont's at-large district in 1990. Prior to that year, the last time a Democrat represented Vermont's at-large district was 1961. So Republicans had a good run of nearly 30 years representing the state of Vermont, but in the 30 years since then, it's been exclusively either independent or Democratic representation. Let's come back to the present though. I have a line graph to show you. Let's bring that up right now. So what you're looking at now are turnout numbers for House candidates in the state of Vermont. You'll notice right away that Democrats outperform Republicans every year over the last decade. And their turnout on average has been increasing every year since 2010. That's what the dotted line is telling us. That's an estimated slope value. Compare that to the Republicans' negative slope value, and you see even more so now than 10 years ago, Democrats have an edge. Little extra note about this graph though, regarding 2016, there was actually no Republican on the ticket that year. It was a member of the Liberty Union Party running against Peter Welch, which might explain his extra surge plus that dip in that red line for 2016. Regardless, Democrats are going to have a pretty easy time winning this seat, so I feel pretty confident in calling it for the Democrats. Let's make that official and put it on our first map. Mark it. So we have Peter Welch coasting to another victory in the state at the House level. Now it's time to talk about the gubernatorial elections in Vermont for 2020. This is where things might get a little weird, and I'll tell you exactly why that is. Vermont is a state that I've talked up as being very progressive, very left-leaning, yet they have one of the most popular governors in the country who is a Republican. I will repeat that. They have one of the most popular governors in the country who is a Republican. He is Governor Phil Scott, and he is running for his 3rd term in the state. Vermont is also unique in the sense that it has gubernatorial elections every 2 years as opposed to every 4 years, something it shares with its neighbor, New Hampshire. Additionally, governors can run indefinitely in Vermont because there are no term limits in the state. Taking a closer look at Phil Scott, we see a governor with an astounding approval rating in the state of net positive plus 43 points. Vermont is a state that maybe more than any other just loves the people that represent them, that govern them. They love their senators, and that can cross party lines. Let's now bring up some gubernatorial to House voter ratios to see how Vermonters vote for their governor. So yeah, you'll notice here that Republican candidates for governor have an insane edge on their Democratic counterparts. Phil Scott's first electoral victory was in 2016, and that value of 575% means that he got nearly 6 times as many votes as the Liberty Union candidate running for the House that year. And his Democratic opponent received just about 52% of the amount of votes that Peter Welch did that year. Looking at the entire decade as a whole, I mean, we even see Democratic candidates really underperforming the House candidates, and the complete opposite for Republican candidates for governor, just getting an insane amount of votes compared to Republicans running for the House. So now that we understand that Republicans have that edge and that Phil Scott has a very, very good approval rating in the state, let's calculate whether or not we think he's going to win, and if he does, by how much. Pollbot, can you do that for us? And there we have it, and it comes as no surprise to this channel that Phil Scott is going to win a third term by about 26% of the vote. This is even an improvement from 2018 when he won by about 15%. So Phil Scott gets to enjoy another 2 years as governor of Vermont. Let's make that official and put it on our gubernatorial map. Mark it. And now it is time to talk about the presidential election of 2020 in the state of Vermont, starring President Donald Trump and likely Democratic challenger Joe Biden. We've seen so far that Vermonters overwhelmingly approve of Democrats in the House, Republicans in the governorship. So what does this mean for these two guys? First, let's start by talking about Donald Trump's approval rating in the state of Vermont. It sucks. Trump is, as of this video, probably not enjoying a negative net approval of minus 39 points. This is one of the absolute worst in the country, up there with Massachusetts and Maryland, but I'm talking about them later. Just take away from this number that Trump has a pretty significant disadvantage from the get-go. For the sake of consistency, let's also look at some presidential to House voter ratios. Let's bring up those numbers right now. So here you go, and these numbers might actually come as a surprise to you because of what I just said about Trump's approval rating, but Republican presidential candidates generally perform better than Republican House candidates in the state of Vermont, whereas Democratic presidential candidates perform worse than Democratic House candidates in the state of Vermont. Of course, we have to keep in mind that these ratios are relative to the turnout for the House, and those numbers looked like this, if you'll recall. Take a closer look at the figures for 2016. So that 327% voter ratio that Trump enjoyed that year was relative to that abysmally low turnout number for the Liberty Union candidate in 2016. In other words, 327% of an extremely low number is probably just a slightly higher extremely low number. Now look at that value in 2016 that Hillary Clinton received. It's about 67%. So she received about 2/3 of the votes that Peter Welch received in 2016, which, as we know, was more than enough to win her the state of Vermont that year. So now we have some ratio values. We have an approval rating figure for President Trump. Let's take all those numbers and calculate the margin of victory for this year. Pollbot. And yet again, we have a Democratic victory in the state of Vermont for 2020. Biden is going to win Vermont handily this year by about 25.88%, in spite of the fact that he was able to oust beloved Senator Bernie Sanders in the primaries. So that's another 3 Electoral College votes for Joe Biden. Let's make that official and put it on our presidential map. Mark it. So we've seen a Welch victory, a Scott victory, and a Biden victory in the state of Vermont. Let's talk briefly about the future of Vermont politics. Let's bring up an old line graph and 2 new ones and get into this. So here we're looking at the House turnout numbers for the state of Vermont over the last decade that you were looking at before. And here we see a Republican Party in the state of Vermont that is just really underperforming compared to their Democratic opponents. I mean, the fact that Republicans didn't even really have a candidate on the ballot in 2016 speaks volumes, and also accounts for their extremely low turnout that year. What this graph says to me is that even after Peter Welch either decides to retire or run for another office, the state is still more likely to elect another Democrat to represent the at-large district. These other 2 line graphs are estimated slope values for the increase or decrease in those gubernatorial to House vote ratios and presidential to House vote ratios. And to be perfectly honest with you, I would take both of these graphs with a pretty significant grain of salt because 2016 was such an outlier year. The reason that Republicans appear to be significantly increasing their ratios is because of Phil Scott's popularity in the state and the underperformance of the Liberty Union candidate in 2016. Looking at these, you'd think that Republicans might even have a chance at winning the presidency in Vermont in 2024, but probably not. This is all relative to those House turnout numbers. Keep that in mind. What I do take away from these trend lines is that Phil Scott can keep running for as long as he wants to, and he's going to win every time. I think the only way we see a Democratic governor come back to Vermont is when Phil Scott retires or runs for another office. My ultimate consensus is that Vermont is becoming more Democratic by the year, and they love Phil Scott. And that just about does it for our most recent episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw today, please hit the subscribe button so you can get updates on new content as it becomes available. I upload videos every Monday and Thursday. I'm also on Twitter, and I upload to that account, which states I'm going to be covering the day before the scheduled release date. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve, please give me a follow on Twitter. That link is in the description. Thanks again for watching, and thank you for voting. See you next time.